And our keynote speaker, Alex, is one of Forbes magazine's 30 Under 30 for Law and Policy in 2017, and is a soon-to-be associate at Bartlett, Beck, Herman, Palancher, and Scott. So Alex recently finished clerking on the Supreme Court of the United States for Justice Anthony Kennedy, before which he clerked for then-Judge Neil Gorsuch on the 10th Circuit. Alex earned his JD from Harvard Law School. Alex, thanks for being here today. We're going to turn it over to you.
You guys are going to have to let me know whether you can hear me okay in the back without the microphone. Are you doing good? Doing good? Great. Let me start by saying thank you to Kyle and the Veritas Forum, to Joe and Erica and the other members of the Christian Legal Society, to Professor Brown, and all of you here who showed up. I was in law school just a few years ago, so I also attended lunch events that held relatively little to no interest for me in order to get free food. And so I just want to say one thing, which I always wished that one of the speakers had said when I was in your shoes, which is, feel free to get up in the middle of my remarks for seconds. I won't be offended. You have my permission. I understand. So this is actually my first time speaking in a setting like this in my capacity as a lawyer. So that's a little different for me, and I'm excited to get to share some of my story and some of the lessons I've learned along the way, and to take your questions at the end. The topic I've been asked to talk about is life after law school. But as you might imagine, it takes more than 2 years after you graduate to kind of master that topic. So I've clerked, I've passed the bar since I graduated in 2015, but I wouldn't call myself a real lawyer just yet, and let alone a wise or experienced one. And all of that is to say that for me to talk about faith and vocation and the law to you, I'm going to be drawing on some of my backstory, so more than just the 2 years since law school. And I hope that will give you a sense of how I came to be the young and inexperienced lawyer I am today, and some of the principles and values that have guided me along the way. So those are some preliminaries, and now to talk about law, vocation, and faith. Now, law and faith are probably pretty familiar quantities for most of us, but vocation is interesting. You probably, when you hear the word vocation, think, as it's commonly used, an occupation or your profession. We're all part of or aspiring to be a part of the legal profession. And in that narrow kind of career path sense, it's worth acknowledging, and it's important for you as law students to think about the fact that our chosen vocation isn't super great. The studies and the surveys back this up. Being a lawyer is not your ticket to a happy and fulfilled life. In fact, according to some surveys, more than half of all attorneys in the United States are dissatisfied with their lives and careers. One notable study found that lawyers had the highest rate of depression of any occupational group. It's well documented that lawyers suffer from high rates of substance abuse. A recent New York Times profile highlighted this. It was a profile of a seemingly an outwardly successful partner at a California intellectual property boutique who died of a drug overdose. Divorce and suicide rates are similarly high, and if that's not enough for you, according to a 2013 Pew Research survey of public esteem for various professions, lawyers ranked dead last in the public's view of which professions contribute to the well-being of society. Now, much of the blame for these kind of sobering, depressing statistics can be placed on the legal profession's obsession with prestige, with money, and with status. Everyone cares about where you went to law school, your class rank, whether you made law review or have a fancy clerkship, which law firm you work for, and how much you get paid. But according to a 2015 study published in the George Washington Law Review, hardly any of those things positively correlate with a happy and fulfilled life in the law. So if you've never given thought to what it actually means to live a fulfilling life in the law, beyond those kind of fancy baubles that the legal profession shines in your face, if you've never given thought to life after law school in that sense, you should. Because as a profession, we're falling pretty miserably short of our goals. What is the antidote? Well, on the personal level, putting aside all those things I'm not qualified to talk about, like how to reform legal education and the legal profession writ large, but on the personal level, what I would propose to you today is that the antidote is to adopt a bigger, a richer, a broader view of vocation. What I mean when I talk about vocation in this sense is an overriding life purpose or calling. It's much more holistic than just what you do for a living. It's your whole life, how everything fits together. With a vocation like that, your legal and your non-legal skills, your personal and your professional relationships, your money, your time, your platform, whatever those might be, all exist to serve that higher calling. It's about being part of a story that's bigger than you. It's about being part of a story that's bigger than the law or your or my very small part of it. And this is where vocation and faith meet. Because throughout history and still today, it is faith that provides that kind of bigger story. Consider just for a moment with me the story found in the pages of the Christian scriptures. A world corrupted by sin, humanity's rebellion against the divine, an audacious rescue mission by God himself entering our earthly existence to suffer, die, and rise again, defeating sin and death on our behalf, who not only saves us from our brokenness, but who saves us from wasting our lives on things that don't matter and that won't satisfy. This is a story filled with themes that resonate with the pursuit of the law. Justice and mercy hand in hand, the equality of all persons made in the image of God, rich or poor, male or female, of every tongue, tribe, and nation, and the protection of the vulnerable, the orphan and the widow, the immigrant, the poor, the oppressed, the vulnerable. Jesus came, he said, to proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and to set at liberty those who are oppressed. But it's about so much more than just the law. This story addresses us as students, as friends, as neighbors, as children, as parents, as spouses, as citizens, and in every role and in every endeavor, it will result in different values and priorities than the world around us and the legal profession around us, but it invites all of us to participate. But all that is pretty theoretical for something that's supposed to filter down into the nitty-gritty of your life. And so that's why I want to take the time to share some of my story. And I don't share my story because it's especially impressive or inspirational. And I also don't share my story under any illusion that I've perfectly lived out the precepts of my faith as we were just discussing. Far, far from it. I share my story because, well, it's the one I know, and because I can't expect you to care what I think about these big reality-defining concepts like faith and vocation if I'm not willing to give you a sense of who I am and where I've come from. So consider this just one imperfect example of how faith and vocation have played out in the life of one young lawyer. I never planned to go to law school. I never planned to go to college. My parents were pioneers in the homeschooling movement, and I was educated at home all the way through high school. My first day of college was actually the first time I ever stepped foot in a formal classroom like this one. And high school for me was self-directed and informal and kind of just mixed in with the rest of life. See, no one in my family had graduated from college, and that didn't mean that education wasn't important. My parents taught me and my siblings to read and to love learning. They trained us to think, to write, and to speak, but they also instilled a really entrepreneurial mindset. They didn't want their kids to settle for the status quo. They wanted us to be reformers, in the best sense of that word, men and women who make the world a better place wherever they happen to be. But college, higher education, was seen as kind of a distraction from all that. Because why would you spend 4 years and tens of thousands of dollars to get a degree, to do something when you could just do it? My twin brother, Brett, and I embraced that mindset. So when we were 16, we finished up our high school studies early, and we started a nonprofit organization to challenge low expectations for teenagers. It started as just a website, and we encouraged our peers not to buy into what we call the myth of adolescence, which is that modern notion that the teen years are just this time to goof off and have fun, and real life starts after high school or after college. And instead, we encouraged them to use the teen years as a training ground, as kind of a launching pad for a lifetime of effective service to God and to the world around them. And that message really seemed to strike a chord. But it was around that time that our family and other mentors also began to encourage us to consider going to college. In a real show of humility, my parents and older siblings explained that there are certain doors down the road that simply will not open without the credential that comes with a college degree. And that encouragement led directly to one of the biggest and craziest decisions I've ever made, one of those path-altering decisions that in one way or the other is responsible for everything that comes after. My college search quickly zeroed in on a tiny little school called Deep Springs College. It's a 2-year college on a working cattle ranch in the high desert of Eastern California. It's one of the smallest and the most selective schools in the country. It admits between 12 and 15 students each year, each of whom receive a full tuition scholarship, and most of whom go on to complete their degrees at institutions like Harvard, Chicago, Brown, and Yale, all places that were unlikely to admit a homeschool graduate like me, because it's kind of hard to fully trust a transcript when the signature at the bottom is the student's mom. I promised that my little Johnny deserved an A+ on his English paper. So this was a big deal, and looking at this school, which since its founding in 1917, it had the mission of preparing young men, and starting next year, young women, of high ability for lives of service to humanity. That mission resonated with me. It seemed kind of like the perfect extension of my upbringing. And so when I learned I'd made it to the second round of the applications process, which was a mandatory 3-day visit, an in-person interview, I was over the moon. I'll never forget my time in Deep Springs. It's an isolated campus. Took a plane ride, 4-hour bus trip, and then another hour drive to get there. The highway actually goes down to a single lane, which is the only time a federal highway goes down to a single lane in the country, in order to get over the pass down into the valley. It's isolated, it's beautiful, and the students that I met there were kind of almost everything I'd hoped. They were friendly, they were interesting, they were brilliant. Many, unlike me, had perfect SAT scores, but something was missing. As one student confided to me, most of them had given up on this idea of service to humanity, at least in a tangible sense. For them, if you give food or medicine to one desperate village, that's just increasing the injustice for all the others. So why even bother? The evening after my interview with the applications committee, and all of the applications and hiring and curriculum decisions are made by the student body of this tiny school, one of the student members pulled me aside and said, I shouldn't be telling you this, but what Deep Springs is supposed to give people, you already have that. I think the school could benefit from having you here, but you don't really need Deep Springs. I thought a lot about those words as I made the long drive, bus, and plane ride home. And in a way, he was right, because as amazing as Deep Springs was, I already felt a deep and an immediate sense of calling to the work that my twin brother and I were doing with our nonprofit work that increasingly involved opportunities to write and to speak and to travel, which would have been very difficult being at Deep Springs, because not only are they isolated, but they have an isolation policy. They have to get permission from the other students to leave the valley, and they also have very limited technology. It's all part of kind of going into the desert and finding yourself and developing that vision for service to humanity. And so when I received a call telling me that I'd been admitted to Deep Springs College, the experience of a lifetime, one that would have opened doors that no one in my family had ever walked through, and which came with a full ride scholarship that was the only way my family could have afforded to send me to college, I turned it down. And it was one of the hardest, but one of the best decisions I ever made. For the next year and a half, Brett and I threw ourselves into our nonprofit work. We wrote a book called Do Hard Things, A Teenage Rebellion Against Low Expectations. We held conferences for teens, parents, and youth workers around the country and internationally, and we saw God take our message about teenage potential and use it in some pretty amazing ways. I'll never forget an email we received from a social worker in the Philippines who shared the story of Daisy. Daisy was the oldest of 8 children in an impoverished Filipino family. At age 15, she escaped from a brothel, and in the aftercare home, she was given our book to help improve her English. But instead, she came away convinced that God could use her, a former teenage prostitute from the slums of Manila. When we got that email, Daisy was a high school graduate and in her second year of college studying legal management. She planned to become a lawyer, the email said, so that she could be a voice for the voiceless. When the time came to go to college, stories like Daisy's and other new and exciting opportunities made it pretty hard to take a step back. But we had become convinced, Brett and I, that whatever work God had for us down the road, we didn't know what that would be, it was bigger, and we needed more training, that we still had a whole lot to learn. And so we chose, in the midst of those exciting opportunities, to go to college. We attended Patrick Henry College, which is a tiny Christian classical liberal arts college in Northern Virginia, just outside DC, and we cut back our traveling during the school year to almost zero. And it was a sacrifice, but it was one that we believed honored God. And it turned out that those 4 years were pivotal ones. I dated and married my wife. I buried my mom after an unexpected diagnosis of stage 4 cancer in the middle of sophomore year. And I welcomed my now almost 6-year-old daughter into the world my senior year. I interned and then worked at International Justice Mission, which is one of the largest anti-slavery organizations in the world. It's one staffed entirely by Christians of all stripes and a whole lot of lawyers who, like William Wilberforce and Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. before them, take seriously the commands of Scripture to seek the good of the poor and oppressed. And because Patrick Henry had little to offer, when it came to competitive athletics, we had athletics, we just weren't competitive. I competed in moot court and mock trial, which helped me discover an interest in and affinity for the law. All of these experiences, virtually none of which would have happened if I had gone to Deep Springs, helped lead me to pursue law school. And it wasn't because I knew exactly what I wanted to do in the legal profession. It was because I saw a law degree as versatile, and because I believed that it was the next best step in developing the skills God had given me. My law school experience itself was probably pretty typical, but different in some small but real ways from many of my peers, at least at Harvard. Coming to law school with a family, my daughter was 8 months old when I started 1L, my obligations to my family and our commitment to faithfully attend services at our local church were more important than school. And that meant treating law school like a 9 to 5, or more realistically, like a 5 or 6 or 7 a.m. to 6 or 6:30 p.m. job. And it meant missing out on classes that met in the evenings. It meant less time hanging out with friends. Even worse, it meant no intramural basketball because those games usually took place at night. It meant, for the most part, not studying in the evenings at all, and restricting my weekend studying to times when my daughter was asleep so I could spend time with her and give my amazing wife a break. And it meant Sunday morning was not a time to sleep in or catch up on reading. All of this remained true for 2 years of clerking, with one blessed exception, which is that there were regular basketball games during the lunch hour at a gym around the street from the Byron White Courthouse in Denver, and, as some of you might know, on the top floor of the Supreme Court building there is a basketball court, the highest court in the land. Maybe my favorite thing about clerking. And I share these details of kind of our daily rhythms and routines, not to say they represent some incredible sacrifice. They don't. But just to give a tangible example, kind of that nitty-gritty I was talking about how different priorities can lead to small but real differences in how we live out our lives as lawyers. Today, I'm getting ready to start my career as a real lawyer, but the story that I'm living isn't any different than it was 10 years ago when I decided to decline Deep Springs. My wife and I decided on Denver over DC because we believed that was what was best for our family and for the larger vocation God has for us. And as I considered where to work, I wanted to go where I could best develop kind of the full complement of legal skills, where I could quickly acquire and start mastering all of the different tools in a legal toolbox. And I wanted to have the flexibility to live out my values and have a life that was bigger than the law firm. And while we're just kind of in the earliest stages of this, my wife and I are in an exciting place because for the first time in 7 years, after years of moving and school and temporary jobs, we're finally able to cast a long-term vision for life rooted in community, seeking the good of our neighborhood and our city, strategizing how to use our income not to raise our standard of living, but to continually up our level of generosity. And this is where all of our resources are being marshaled to make the world around us a better place. That still evolving vision, not my soon-to-be day job, is my vocation. So 2 final points before we move on to some questions. First, I recognize that all my remarks raise legitimate questions like, well, why Christianity? I like your aspirations, Alex, but can't anybody, including people of different faiths and no faith at all, choose to live just and positive and generous lives? And don't many Christians, or so-called Christians, live lives that are marked by just the opposite? The short answer is that I have not found another view of reality that provides an intellectually and emotionally satisfying basis for justice, for morality, for equality, or the idea of human rights. I have not found another that purports to present truth with a capital T while simultaneously making clear that any form of pride or oppression by its adherents is a twisted perversion of its message. And I have not found another that provides a foundation for meaning and an enduring joy when all the good things of this life, health, wealth, reputation, relationships, are stripped away. Faith is often viewed both within and outside religious communities as kind of a blind belief, the well-worn leap of faith. But faith in Scripture is a reasoned and a reasonable reliance that is rooted in historical fact, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth as foretold hundreds of years before by the Old Testament prophets. If you've never confronted this evidence for Christianity, or if you've never confronted a vision for the Christian faith beyond the co-opted cultural shell of Christianity that is so prevalent in the United States, I encourage you to take a look. And I have 2 books to recommend, both by Tim Keller, a Christian pastor in New York City. The first is called Making Sense of God, and the second is The Reason for God. Making Sense for God is a positive case for why faith and Christianity are worth your time. And it is worth your time. The latter, the second book, The Reason for God, addresses many of the intellectual objections that people legitimately have to faith, like the existence of evil and suffering in the world and the way that Christianity has been used throughout history to justify oppression and other atrocities. So Making Sense of God and The Reason for God by Tim Keller. Second, and finally, I can't emphasize enough that living as part of this bigger story is not some secret mechanism for achieving professional accolades. It's not about using the affluence of the legal profession to be big-hearted and pat yourself on the back. I recognize that the opportunities that God has given me are a big part of the reason why I was even invited to talk to you today, but if I gave you or left you with the impression that my sense of well-being or my worth is tied up in those things, I'd be doing you a profound disservice. When I grow up, I want to be like my twin brother. Brett is a better speaker and a writer than I am. One profile of us back in our conference days said that Brett had the persona of the world's coolest youth pastor, while I came across like someone trying to sell you a timeshare. Guess which one of us became a lawyer? But our nonprofit work, our book, our conferences, all of the things that opened doors for me in law school and beyond, Brett was an indispensable and equal partner in all of those. If he'd wanted to, he could have been the one standing up here talking to you about law and vocation and faith. So what is Brett up to today? Well, for the past 5 years, beginning just after he got married, Brett has been the primary caretaker for his wife, Anna, as she has suffered from a devastating combination of Lyme disease and mold poisoning. For most of those years, Anna, a brilliant and vibrant dancer when they got married, was bedridden and entirely dependent on Brett as her body and mind fell apart. He has dropped everything to lay down his life for Anna. 6 months ago, things got so bad for Anna that they were forced to abandon most of their earthly possessions and every support system and basic luxury, pursuing a treatment plan of extreme avoidance, literally camping in the desert in the middle of nowhere, miles from civilization. And somehow Brett has walked through that living hell while maintaining a profound hope and a willingness to serve his wife that is simply not of this world. And somehow, despite everything that they have gone through, Brett and Anna have a shared vision for a life of radical generosity that is a big part of the inspiration for me and my wife. What Brett is doing now, what he has done for the past 5 years, dwarfs the significance or the difficulty of anything I've accomplished in the law. But while our paths are outwardly different, Brett would tell you we are living the same vocation, the same life purpose, to faithfully follow our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, to love and to serve like he did wherever we find ourselves. We are both part of the same bigger story. Thank you all so much.